The cold silence of space stretched endlessly before them. Ethan sat in the pilot's chair, gripping the controls of the stolen alien fighter. Beside him, Princess Zyra stared at the stars, her golden eyes filled with worry. Behind them, the alarm still echoed in their minds. Her father had sent hunters after them, and they would not stop until both of them were dead. "This ship is fast, but it won't outrun them forever," Ethan said, scanning the monitors. "We need a place to hide." Zyra bit her lip, thinking. "There is one place," she said. "The human colony on Veros 9. My father destroyed their defenses years ago. They hate the Empire. Maybe they will help us." Ethan frowned. He had heard of Veros 9. It was a broken world, left in ruins after the war, but it was their best chance. "Then let's go," he said. He set the coordinates and pushed the engines to their limit. The ship shot forward, disappearing into hyperspace, a planet of survivors. Veros 9 was as ruined as Ethan remembered. The city was a skeleton of metal and stone, barely holding together. Fires burned in the distance, and people moved in the shadows, watching with suspicious eyes. As Ethan and Zyra stepped out of the ship, armed guards surrounded them. Their leader, a scared man named Captain Rowe, narrowed his eyes. "A human and an alien princess," he muttered. "This should be interesting." "We're not your enemies," Ethan said, raising his hands. "We need help." Rowe scoffed. "Help? The Empire burned our cities and killed our families. And now its princess walks among us." He turned to his soldiers. "What do you say, men? Should we throw them into the fire like they did to us?" The crowd murmured angrily. Ethan could see the hate in their eyes. "I am not my father," Zyra said, stepping forward. "I chose Ethan, and now I choose to fight against the Empire. If you help us, we can strike back. Together." Silence filled the air. Then Rowe laughed. "You think a princess and a single soldier can change the war?" "We have a ship," Ethan said. "We have weapons, and we know the Empire's weaknesses." Rowe's eyes flickered with interest. "Prove it," he said. "The first battle." Before Ethan could answer, the ground shook. The sky turned red as enemy ships roared overhead. The hunters had found them. "Damn it," Ethan shouted, grabbing his rifle. "Get to cover." The enemy forces landed with brutal speed. Black armored warriors stormed the colony, their weapons firing beams of blue energy. Explosions tore through the ruins. Ethan moved fast, using the broken buildings as cover. He aimed and fired, taking down the first wave of soldiers. Zyra fought beside him, using her alien blade with deadly precision. Rowe and his men hesitated for only a moment. Then they joined the fight. They had spent years hating the Empire. Now they had a reason to strike back. The battle was fierce, but Ethan's human tactics changed everything. He used surprise, traps, and teamwork, something the Empire's warriors had never faced before. When the dust settled, the hunters lay dead. The colony still stood, and Rowe looked at Ethan with newfound respect. "You might just be as dangerous as they say," he said. "All right, we'll help you." Zyra smiled, but Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The Empire would not stop hunting them. The real war was yet to come. The cold silence of space stretched endlessly before them. Ethan sat in the pilot's chair, gripping the controls of the stolen alien fighter. Beside him, Princess Zyra stared at the stars, her golden eyes filled with worry. Behind them, the alarm still echoed in their minds. Her father had sent hunters after them, and they would not stop until both of them were dead. "This ship is fast, but it won't outrun them forever," Ethan said, scanning the monitors. "We need a place to hide." Zyra bit her lip, thinking. "There is one place," she said. "The human colony on Veros 9. My father destroyed their defenses years ago. They hate the Empire. Maybe they will help us." Ethan frowned. He had heard of Veros 9. It was a broken world, left in ruins after the war, but it was their best chance. "Then let's go," he said. He set the coordinates and pushed the engines to their limit. The ship shot forward, disappearing into hyperspace. Veros 9 was as ruined as Ethan remembered. The city was a skeleton of metal and stone, barely holding together. Fires burned in the distance, and people moved in the shadows, watching with suspicious eyes. As Ethan and Sarah stepped out of the ship, armed guards surrounded them. Their leader, a scared man named Captain Rowe, narrowed his eyes. "A human and an alien princess," he muttered. "This should be interesting." "We're not your enemies," Ethan said, raising his hands. "We need help." Rowe scoffed. "Help? The Empire burned our cities and killed our families. And now its princess walks among us." He turned to his soldiers. "What do you say, men? Should we throw them into the fire like they did to us?" The crowd murmured angrily. Ethan could see the hate in their eyes. "I am not my father," Tyra said, stepping forward. "I chose Ethan, and now I choose to fight against the Empire. If you help us, we can strike back. Together." Silence filled the air. Then Rowe laughed. "You think a princess and a single soldier can change the war?" "We have a ship," Ethan said. "We have weapons, and we know the Empire's weaknesses." Rowe's eyes flickered with interest. "Prove it," he said. Before Ethan could answer, the ground shook. The sky turned red as enemy ships roared overhead. The hunters had found them. "Damn it," Ethan shouted, grabbing his rifle. "Get to cover." The enemy forces landed with brutal speed. Black armored warriors stormed the colony, their weapons firing beams of blue energy. Explosions tore through the ruins. Ethan moved fast, using the broken buildings as cover. He aimed and fired, taking down the first wave of soldiers. Thyra fought beside him, using her alien blade with deadly precision. Rowe and his men hesitated for only a moment. Then they joined the fight. They had spent years hating the Empire. Now they had a reason to strike back. The battle was fierce, but Ethan's human tactics changed everything. He used surprise, traps, and teamwork, something the Empire's warriors had never faced before. When the dust settled, the hunters lay dead. The colony still stood, and Rowe looked at Ethan with newfound respect. "You might just be as dangerous as they say," he said. "All right, we'll help you." Thyra smiled, but Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The Empire would not stop hunting them. The real war was yet to come. The underground base of Veros 9 was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of metal and old fires. Ethan sat on an old crate, cleaning his rifle while Cyrus spoke with Captain Rowe. The colony's leader was still wary of them, but after the battle, he knew they had a common enemy. His people gathered around, listening as Tyra explained her plan. She wanted to strike at the Empire, to show her father that she would not be controlled. Rowe crossed his arms. "Even if we help you, how do we win against an empire that has ruled for centuries?" Ethan looked up. "We don't fight them head-on," he said. "We use their own strength against them. The Empire underestimates humans. We fight differently. We adapt. That's how we survived when they invaded Earth." He stood up and looked at the gathered soldiers. "You all know how they fight. But do they know how you fight?" The humans in the room exchanged glances. They had spent years in hiding, but they had not forgotten their rage. Rowe finally nodded. "You have a plan." "We start by stealing something valuable," Ethan said. "A weapon, a ship, something they'll chase, something that will make them afraid." Thyra stepped forward. "There's a warship stationed on the edge of this sector, a Royal-class destroyer. It carries advanced weapons, supplies, and most importantly, information." She turned to Rowe. "If we take it, we don't just hurt my father's fleet. We gain power." The room fell silent. Then a young soldier spoke. "Stealing the Royal-class destroyer. That's suicide." Others muttered in agreement, but Ethan smirked. "Only if we do it their way," he said. "We're going to take it the human way." Preparations began immediately. Rowe provided a small, fast ship. an old smuggler vessel that barely held together, but it was perfect for their plan. Ethan studied the Empire's patrol patterns, looking for weaknesses. Zira used her knowledge of the ship's systems, explaining where the security was weakest. The colony's best fighters volunteered for the mission, willing to risk everything for a chance to strike back. The night before the attack, Zira sat beside Ethan on the edge of the outpost, looking up at the stars. "Do you think this will work?" she asked. Ethan glanced at her and smiled slightly. "It has to," he said, "because if it doesn't, we won't get another chance." The next day, they launched. Their small ship cut through space, approaching the massive destroyer in the distance. Ethan took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. The Empire had ruled unchecked for too long. Tonight, that would change. The stolen smuggler ship drifted through the darkness of space, hidden among the debris of a long-forgotten battle. The massive Royal-class destroyer loomed ahead, its sleek silver hull reflecting the distant stars. Ethan gripped the controls tightly, his heart pounding. This was it. One wrong move, and they would all be dead. Zira stood beside him, her golden eyes scanning the ship's defense grid. "There's a small maintenance hangar on the lower level," she whispered. "If we get close enough, I can override the security locks." Ethan nodded and guided the ship forward, using the wreckage around them as cover. Inside the ship, Ro and the other human fighters checked their weapons. They were nervous but determined. The Empire had taken everything from them. Tonight, they would take something back. As they approached, a deep voice crackled through the ship's speakers. "Unidentified vessel, state your purpose." The Empire had noticed them. Zira's fingers flew across the controls, sending out a fake identification code. "This is a supply transport," she said, her voice steady. "We've been ordered to dock for emergency repairs." There was a long silence. Ethan could feel sweat on his brow. Then the reply came. "Proceed to Hangar C. Any deviation will be met with force." Ethan exhaled, guiding the ship toward the hangar. As they slipped inside, the doors sealed shut behind them. There was no escape now. The moment they landed, Ethan and the others moved fast. Zira hacked into the security system, disabling the cameras and sealing off the upper decks. Ro and his fighters spread out, taking down unsuspecting guards with silenced weapons. The ship was massive, but they had a plan. Head straight for the control room, take over the ship, and disable the distress signals before the Empire realized what was happening. But things didn't go as planned. As they reached the first security checkpoint, alarms blared. The Empire's soldiers were already waiting. It was a trap. "Get to cover," Ethan shouted, diving behind a cargo crate as plasma fire rained down. Ro's men returned fire, but they were outnumbered. The hallway turned into a battlefield, bodies falling on both sides. Zira pressed her back against the wall, her mind racing. Her father had expected this. He had known she would come. That meant only one thing: he was watching. Ethan reloaded his rifle and looked at her. "We're running out of time," he said. "Can you still override the ship's systems?" Zira hesitated, then nodded. "I need to get to the main terminal. Then we push forward," Ethan said. No matter what. The battle intensified as they moved through the ship. The Empire's soldiers fought fiercely, but Ethan and his team were faster, smarter. They used shadows, surprise, and human tactics the Empire had never encountered before. Step by step, they carved a path toward the control room. Finally, they reached it. Zira rushed to the terminal, her hands flying over the controls. "I'm in," she said, shutting down external communications now. Ethan turned just as the door burst open. More enemy soldiers poured in, surrounding them. They were trapped. A deep, familiar voice echoed through the speakers. "You disappoint me, daughter." Zira froze. It was him, the alien king. Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle. The Empire had found them. But they weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The air inside the control room grew heavy as the alien king's voice echoed through the ship. Zyra's fingers trembled over the console, but she forced herself to keep typing. If she could just finish overriding the ship's systems, they might still have a chance. Ethan scanned the room. They were surrounded. Elite Imperial soldiers blocked every exit, their weapons trained on them. Ro and his fighters stood ready, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. Fighting their way out wasn't an option. You should have known better, daughter. The alien king's voice continued. You cannot run from me, and you cannot win. Zyra's heart pounded. I am not running, she said, her voice shaking but strong. I am choosing my own path. The king let out a low, rumbling laugh. And what has your choice given you? You stand in my ship, cornered like prey. Your human is a fool, leading you to destruction. But I will offer you mercy. Surrender, and I will spare you. Ethan smirked. Yeah. What about me? There was a pause. Then the king's voice turned cold. You will die, of course. Slowly. Ethan chuckled and glanced at Zyra. Sounds fair. Then, without warning, he lifted his rifle and fired. Not at the soldiers, but at the control panel. Sparks exploded as the ship's systems went haywire. The lights flickered, alarms blared, and for a moment, the Imperial soldiers hesitated. That was all the time Ethan needed. Now, he shouted. Ro and his fighters sprang into action, firing at the stunned guards. Zyra, still at the console, pressed the final command. The ship's security doors slammed shut, locking out reinforcements. Then she turned to Ethan. We need to get to the bridge. If we can take control, we can fly this ship out of here. Ethan nodded. Then let's move. They rushed out of the control room, blasting their way through any remaining guards. The ship shook violently. Zyra's sabotage had triggered a chain reaction, and they didn't have much time before the entire system collapsed. As they neared the bridge, a massive explosion rocked the ship. The hull ahead of them was engulfed in fire and debris. Their path was blocked. Damn it, Ro cursed. We're trapped. Ethan scanned the area. There was only one way left, through the ship's maintenance tunnels. It was risky, but they had no choice. He pulled open a hatch in the wall and gestured for the others to follow. Come on, we're not done yet. They crawled through the narrow tunnels, the heat from the burning corridors making it almost unbearable. Behind them, the sound of approaching soldiers echoed through the vents. The Empire was not letting them escape. Finally, they'd reached the exit. Ethan kicked open the hatch, and they spilled onto the bridge. The crew inside turned in shock, but Sarah was faster. She raised her father's royal insignia and shouted, "Stand down," by order of the princess. For a brief second, the officers hesitated. That was all Ethan needed. He and Ro's fighters took them down, securing the bridge in seconds. Zyra ran to the captain's chair, her hands flying over the controls. I'm taking command of the ship, she said. Ethan, get ready to fly. He slid into the pilot's seat, grinning. Always wanted to fly one of these. But just as they thought they had won, the ship's main screen flickered on. The alien king's face appeared, his expression unreadable. You have stolen my warship, he said. You have betrayed your blood. And now, you will learn what it means to defy me. Zyra's breath caught in her throat. Ethan clenched his jaw. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The bridge of the Royal-class destroyer was silent, except for the hum of the ship's failing systems. Zyra stared at the screen, her father's piercing gaze locking onto her. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried the weight of a ruler who had never been defied. You have made your choice, the alien king said. Now you will suffer the consequences. Ethan gripped the controls, his instincts screaming that they had to move. Now. Zyra, whatever you're doing, do it fast, he muttered, because I don't think he's bluffing. Zyra's hands flew over the control panel. She had disabled most of the Empire's security protocols, but she wasn't finished yet. The ship was still connected to the Imperial network, and if her father had a failsafe, he would use it any second now. A sudden jolt rocked the ship. Alarms blared. A deep metallic voice echoed through the speakers. Remote override engaged. Engines disabled. Self-destruct in 5 minutes. Ethan swore under his breath. Of course he has a self-destruct. Why wouldn't he? Ro and his fighters looked around in panic. "We need to get out of here," one of them said. "No," Gyra snapped. "I can stop this." She clenched her fists, forcing herself to think. Her father was trying to break her, to show her that she had no power against him. But he had underestimated her. He had underestimated them all. Ethan turned to her. "How do we stop it?" Gyra exhaled sharply. "I need to cut the ship from the Imperial network. If I do that, my father loses control." Ethan's grip on his rifle tightened. "And how do we do that?" Gyra hesitated. "The core room. It's the only place I can sever the link." Another explosion shook the ship. The countdown dropped to 4 minutes. Ethan looked at Ro. "Get everyone to the escape pods. If we fail, you need to make sure this wasn't for nothing." Ro hesitated, then nodded. "You better not fail." He and his team sprinted toward the exit, leaving Ethan and Gyra alone. The two of them ran through the burning corridors, dodging falling debris and enemy fire. The Alien King's soldiers were still on board, fighting to reclaim the ship. But Ethan and Gyra didn't stop. They pushed forward, deeper into the heart of the vessel. They reached the core room with 2 minutes left. Gyra dove toward the terminal, her fingers flying over the controls. "I need 30 seconds, she yelled. Ethan turned as soldiers stormed in. He didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, cutting them down before they could get a shot off. More came, but he kept fighting, buying Gyra the time she needed. "Almost there," Gyra whispered, sweat dripping down her face. A plasma blast grazed Ethan's shoulder. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, and kept firing. The countdown reached 30 seconds. Then, Gyra slammed her fist on the console. "Done," she cried. The ship's alarms silenced. The self-destruct sequence stopped at 07. Ethan exhaled in relief, but there was no time to celebrate. Gyra grabbed his hand. "We have to go." They sprinted back to the bridge, dodging the last of the Empire's forces. Ethan slid into the pilot's seat, gripping the controls. "Let's see what this thing can do." The ship roared to life, engines flaring. The Imperial fleet outside turned toward them, but Ethan didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle to full power. The destroyer blasted forward, breaking through the blockade. The Alien King's voice echoed through the speakers one last time. "You have made an enemy of the Empire, my daughter. There will be no place in the stars where you can hide." Gyra stared at the screen. Then she lifted her chin. "I'm not hiding." She reached out and cut the transmission. Ethan smirked. "Guess that means we're officially wanted now." Gyra looked at him and smiled. "Good. Let them come." As the stolen warship vanished into hyperspace, the legend of the human warrior and the Alien King's daughter had only just begun. The stolen warship shot through hyperspace, leaving the Empire's fleet behind. The stars outside the viewport blurred into streaks of light as Ethan leaned back in the pilot's seat, breathing heavily. His shoulder burned from the plasma wound, but he ignored the pain. They had done it. They had escaped. Gyra stood beside him, her golden eyes scanning the navigation system. The Empire would not stop hunting them. Her father would not stop. "Where do we go now?" she asked. Ethan smirked. "Anywhere but back." Ro and his surviving fighters had regrouped in the warship's lower deck. They were exhausted, wounded, but alive. They had stolen a Royal-class destroyer, one of the most powerful warships in the Empire's fleet. It was a victory, but a dangerous one. The Empire would throw everything they had to get it back. Gyra turned to Ethan. This ship has weapons, but not enough to fight an entire fleet alone. We need allies. Ethan nodded. I know some people. He set a course for an outlaw system, one where the Empire had no control. The kind of place where criminals, rebels, and mercenaries gathered. If they were going to start a war against the Empire, they couldn't do it alone. As the ship exited hyperspace, a massive space station came into view. It was ancient, built from the ruins of forgotten civilizations. Hundreds of ships floated around it, pirates, smugglers, and rogue warriors. It was a dangerous place, but exactly what they needed. Ethan brought the ship in for landing. As they stepped onto the station, the air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. Strange alien creatures lurked in the shadows, their eyes watching the newcomers with interest. A towering reptilian warrior approached, his scared face twisting into a grin. Didn't expect to see a human here, and certainly not the Empire's runaway princess. Shira lifted her chin. We're not here to hide. We need an army. The warrior laughed. And what do you have to offer? Ethan smirked. How about an Imperial warship? The crowd around them fell silent. Then the warrior's grin widened. Now you have my attention. Shira glanced at Ethan, her heart racing. This was just the beginning. Her father would come for them, and the Empire would not rest until they were crushed. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. As the outlaws gathered around, hungry for battle, the legend of the human warrior and the alien king's daughter was only beginning. The war against the Empire had just begun.